you all here today. Today is a really interesting day. So I'm going to tell you, we're going to do two things. The first thing that I think is important is we're going to talk about why today is an important day in the church, right? But before we do that, we need to talk a little bit about what's happening. So we're starting a new sermon series. That sermon series is based on the Enneagram. And I know that you all love this series. So I'm going to let Michelle handle that. Deep dive, we're not going to really cover that. We're going to spend the next couple of Sundays together talking about the Epiphany and the manifestation of Christ. I'm going to talk about why that's important. And we're going to talk about sort of how we get this season of Epiphany. And I hope that it will add a little bit to your understanding of why during the season of Epiphany we've done or are doing this Enneagram series. I think it will all connect really nicely together. So let's talk about Epiphany, right? So, I mean, I wonder, we say that, this is the Christmas season ends with Epiphany, Epiphany Sunday, that would be today. Actual Epiphany, the actual Christmas season will end January 5th with the day of Epiphany celebrated on January 6th. But we're going to celebrate it here as the first Sunday of Epiphany today. So what is Epiphany? I think in the Protestant tradition, definitely in the Protestant tradition, we've lost a little bit of this emphasis on Epiphany. And as I was doing some research, we're actually not the only ones who feel that way. The Catholics sort of lost this emphasis on Epiphany too, as they sort of changed their rites around it and focused on different aspects of the liturgical calendar. So there's a whole movement, y'all, just like there was a whole movement to reclaim Advent. There's this whole movement to reclaim Epiphany as well. So I'm really excited to talk with you all a little bit about that. So let's talk about Epiphany. What is it? Why do we do it? Well, the first thing is to remember, like we talked about last week, or as I talked about my children's message, because you and I, we weren't together last week, that Epiphany is this, the Christmas season is 12 days long, right? We often, especially here in the United States, tend to do all of our Christmas celebration during the time of Advent. Then we have Christmas, and then we say Christmas is over. But really, that's not how the calendar works. We have this season of Advent, which is supposed to be this time of preparation and penance to prepare ourselves for Christmas. We experience Christmas, the day of Christmas, and that sets off 12 days of Christmas. So then through those 12 days, then we get to Epiphany, right? So we just kind of have done everything a little bit backwards. We've inverted it. And so we come to Epiphany. So Epiphany, as the story goes, is the day that we celebrate when the wise men show up in the story of Jesus. So one, why do we call it Epiphany, and why is it important? I mean, it's kind of weird when you think about it. You have like these three kings based on the song, right? Three kings of Orient who travel a really long way following a star to find a baby. It's kind of this weird story until you realize that there's really a whole lot to it. So the 12 days that we have between Christmas Day and Epiphany are part of what we call an octave. And this is definitely not a word that we use very much in the church at all anymore. And everything we think about, right, in the Bible always is around the seven, right? Seven's the number of wholeness and completeness. But there's actually a tradition of eights as well, octave. So you celebrate a feast, and then you celebrate an octave. 8 days later, you celebrate that feast again. And that's part of this whole 12 days of Christmas. So the octave, it is biblical, and it's prescribed by Mosaic law. So we have the 8 days, right, after birth. In Mosaic law, the law of Moses would be, the day of Jesus's birth, right? So the 25th. 8 days later, he would have been circumcised. And that's a big deal in the Jewish tradition. And so it becomes part of this whole octave here, right? So why is this important? Well, it focuses on this word manifestation. What does that mean? Well, the Epiphany is the manifestation of Christ in the world. So Christ is born into the world, but Christ doesn't actually become part of our world until people start to recognize that this baby, Jesus, is the Messiah. And so that happens in three ways, right? Throughout Jesus's life, really starts us off. The first one, the very first one is the arrival of the Magi. And the story is really important because it's not just people realizing that Jesus is in the world, that the Christ is in the world, but it's the manifestation of Christ to the nations, right? We're not talking, the shepherds come and they see Jesus, but that's the Jewish revelation, right? They go and they tell their friends, but they're telling their Jewish friends about what has just happened. The arrival of the Magi is the message of Christ that goes out much further. Remember, Christ isn't just here to save the Jewish elect, like we saw in the Old Testament. Christ here is for all people, right? For all nations, and makes all people elect, right? So this is a really, really, really important moment if you're not Jewish and you're here, part of Kingstown Communion. I'm guessing you're not very Jewish, right? So this moment, we should probably be celebrating it a little bit more because it's the message that Christ is for all people. So the second piece of the manifestation that comes the second Sunday of Epiphany is the presentation of Jesus at the temple. This is where Simon recognizes Jesus as the Christ. Remember the story of Simon? He wasn't going to die until the Messiah was born, and he realizes in this baby that his prayers have been fulfilled, right? So that's the second, right? This realization that the Christ is here. And then the third, that comes the third Sunday of Epiphany. See how this all works? Is when Jesus turns water to wine at the miracle at Cana, right? So that's when everyone realizes that this is not just Mary's son. This guy's got some stuff going on. So we get to this place and this Epiphany is a really important liturgical season. It's very important for us because Jesus just being born is cool and stuff, but it's what Jesus actually does in this world for us, right? That really matters. So this Sunday, we're going to talk a little bit about the Magi and these three kings. Next Sunday, I'm going to talk about Jesus and the presentation at the temple. And then the Sunday after that, we're going to talk about this miracle at Cana and why it's so important for our understanding of Jesus's work in the world. So let's talk a little bit about sort of what we're doing here with the Magi. So if I say, tell me about the wise men, you all are probably going to sing "We Three Kings of Orient Are." I mean, I just can't imagine that you're probably not going to do that because one, it's basically the only song that most all of us know about the wise men. There are others, but it's the one. And I will tell you, it's one of my personal favorites only because, and this is going to date me here. You're going to know a little bit about my age here because of the California Raisins singing it on TV every Christmas, right? That is my favorite song because that was my favorite interpretation where the camels are singing and then the claymation of the stained glass. I wish I could find it, but I can't. So the Magi, they're important, and they're important not just because they're in the story, but because they represent the manifestation of Christ, the presentation of Christ to the nations. So who are the Magi, right? Who are these guys that we call kings? Well, when you read the book of Matthew, there's never any mention in here about kings, right? That's not who we are. They say the book of Matthew says three Magi. So the word magi comes from the Greek word magos, and it really is just kind of like a wise guy, not like a wise guy like Jersey style, but a wise person. In this case, somebody who really, studying the stars, which is a science, astrology. I'm sorry, astronomy, not astrology, but a little bit of astrology in there too. Actually, at this point, they were kind of melded together. But studied astronomy, studied the stars in the sky, studied the way things moved, right? And they noticed this star appearing. And so they travel then from wherever, because it doesn't say, it just says from the land from where the sun rises is really what the Greek translation says, to Bethlehem. So we say they traveled from the east, right? Because that would be where the sun rises. But it's kind of this nebulous east. And I actually think that's kind of important because for this Matthean community, it probably was a really nebulous east. There was a lot of trading happening, but I mean, I don't know how much the community really could have like even imagined like the Mongol Empire, right? I really just don't think they could have even thought about necessarily the land beyond, right, their basic borders here and sort of like the Palestinian area. So this is where they go. This is where they're from, this sort of nebulous east. And the Magi, so they show up, right? And they show up in their bearing. And here's what's interesting is it doesn't even tell us three in the book, right? It just says the magoi, right? Magoi, plural. So we know it's more than one. And they come bearing gifts. So again, like I said, we know it's plural. They come bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which are all really important things that sort of speak to Jesus's prophecy, or sorry, the prophetic nature of Jesus. And so we don't really know how many. We assume in our tradition, we assume three because there were three gifts. But Eastern Orthodox traditions number it at 12. 12 Magi show up. And it doesn't actually even tell us when they show up, right? It's like cut scene in Matthew. All of a sudden the Magi are showing up. And in our art, and in our, little nativity scenes and things like that, we put the Magi into the same space and time as Jesus's birth. But it could have, let's be really honest, travel in that time could have taken forever, especially if they're traveling by I don't know if you guys have ever been on a camel, but they don't move really quickly. They just don't. And in fact, they're pretty stubborn and sometimes they don't move at all. So they could have taken, weeks to get from wherever they were coming from, this nebulous east, to wherever Jesus was at this point. It could have been Bethlehem. It could have been somewhere else, right? We're not entirely sure. Some scholars will say it took a couple of weeks, and so the family was still in Bethlehem. They hadn't gone back to the area of Nazareth, which is where they were, where they technically called home. But some scholars argue that it was close to 2 years before the Magi show up. And they say this because in the next thing, right, the Magi visit Herod. They're like, where is this king who's changing everything? Where has he been born? And Herod's like, I don't know what you're talking about. This freaks me out, right? And so what does Herod do? What's their cut scene in Matthew? Well, Herod orders the slaughter of the innocents, right? All firstborn children under the age of 2. And so some scholars argue that if in fact Jesus, this happened really soon after Jesus was born, there would be no reason for Herod to kill all of the babies under the age of 2. They could have just, in the last couple of months, right? but Herod says under the age of 2. So this idea is that perhaps it took up to 2 years for the Magi to find Jesus. It's entirely possible. So it's just these really smart dudes basically who are coming from a nebulous east to find Jesus sometime in the span between his birth and age 2. This is what we know from the Bible. This is what we know. And yet we know them as 3 kings. We give them names, right? Balthasar, Melchior, and Casper. And we have all of these details about who these guys were. So where is it coming from? Because I'm telling you, it's not coming from the book of Matthew. I'm glad that you all asked. So it's coming from a lot of really interesting stories that come after the book of Matthew, maybe not very far after, but after for sure. So one of the things, where does this concept of king come from? Well, there's 2 places that I would argue that this probably comes from. The first, which is really widely argued by a lot of scholars, is that we interpret them as kings because it fulfills the prophecy that's in Psalms 72, right? Where it says that all kings are going to fall down before him. And so this moment in the book of Matthew, which is heavily tied, right, to Old Testament scripture, which we've talked about before, this fulfills this prophecy. So it would make sense in Matthew's story that they would be kings here, although Matthew never explicitly says that. And knowing Matthew, you would think that he would explicitly say that because that's what Matthew does. He explicitly says things about this. And it's why Jesus has to go to Egypt, right? Jesus becomes the new Moses, so he has to go to Egypt in order to come out of Egypt, just like Moses, right? Matthew says that. So Matthew doesn't say that they're kings. I think that's really fascinating. Here's what I think, right? These guys are pretty powerful people. And in this culture, being able to bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh, these are very costly. In fact, they're really costly. If you've ever tried to buy like a frankincense essential oil, you'll know that it's super costly. So they bring these really expensive gifts, and they apparently have a lot of power because they're being seen by Herod, right? And the king Herod isn't just going to see just random riffraff, right? So there's this idea that comes from, I think, even the culture of this time period, that these guys, they have to be kings. And so it gets written down in a variety of stories following that they were kings. One particular is called the Syriac Infancy Gospel. So this was written sometime around the 6th century. But it actually it has basis in stories that are earlier, including the Gospel of Thomas. And so this story really is very explicit about the names, about where they come from. So in the tradition that we have, the Magi have these really distinct characteristics that get developed, right? We know that there are 3 adult men. They come from 3 different geographical and cultural areas, and they bring 3 separate gifts. So in one tradition, which you can see in the art, right? Look at the artwork of the medieval and early Renaissance, and you're going to see you can see this stuff, right? So in this tradition, Casper is old, right? It puts him at 60 years old. He's old. He has a white beard. He's the one who gives the gold. He's the one who bows down first, okay? He's known as the king of Tarsus, from a land of merchants, so off of the coast of Turkey. All right. Then we have Melchior, who is middle-aged. It puts his age at 40. He gives the frankincense. He's from Arabia. And then we have Balthasar, who is this young man, aged 20. And he's often the most dark of them all, and he's giving myrrh from Saba, which is in southern Yemen, right? And then they say, there's a couple of places in these stories where they say, in the Syriac Infancy Gospel especially, says that they're explicitly pursuing a prophecy coming from their prophet Zoroaster, who is the Persian Zoroastrianism. You might have heard of that. So it ties everything together, right? And so there's some really interesting things that are happening in this story that we have just come, and it's become gospel to us. but it's not the actual gospel, because the actual gospel of Matthew just sort of says these three guys or it actually doesn't say sorry, these guys, these magi from this nebulous east come. And that's what we know. And they start the story then of how Jesus becomes the new Moses, right? So they're the impetus for the story of sending of Mary and Joseph and Jesus escaping to Egypt so they can come back out of Egypt later so that Jesus could become the new Moses. So it's really sort of like they're like a literary device in some ways, but they're also part of the story, and we've developed this really rich tradition around them. And so often in a lot of countries, especially Catholic countries, on January 5th, right? So Epiphany Eve, we call it the 12th night. Shakespeare, right? Did you know that that's what it was talking about? So the 12th night is the last night of the Christmas feast. And so that is when that's when these kings are being celebrated, right? And so on Epiphany Sunday, so there's this whole party, and they serve most of these countries serve what's called a king cake. In French, galette de roi, but in Spanish, pardon my my Spanish, but it's rosca del reyes, and so it's eaten. This king cake. But here in the United States, what do we do with the king cake? We push it to Lent. We push it to Fat Tuesday, to Mardi Gras. We cover it in Mardi Gras colors, and we call it a king cake because we put a baby Jesus inside. But it comes from this tradition of Epiphany and from these three kings who become the first non-Jewish people in the story to recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christ, and that Jesus is going to change the world. And I think that that is really, really fascinating. And so just as they became suddenly aware, right, of this newness that was happening, that was transforming the world, here in the season of Epiphany, we ask ourselves and each other and our communities to lean into this manifestation of Christ and see the transformation that Christ does in our world, in us, through us, and with us. And that's why we're doing the Enneagram as a way of sort of leaning into this sort of transformational nature of Epiphany. Next week, we're going to talk about the miracle, it is a miracle. We're going to talk about the presentation of the temple and how that ties into Epiphany as well. Thanks for being here with me this morning. We'll be at worship in 7 minutes, so I got to get off so we can get stuff ready for that. But I'm so glad that you were here. I see everyone here. Anton just posted the California raisins. I love you, Anton. Thank you. So that's really exciting. I'll see you all in worship really shortly. Thanks for being here with me.